Hi. Oh, that light's, I need to stand where the light isn't in my face. Okay. Oh, goodness. Okay. Over here.
Okay.
Yeah, does that work?
That works.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to the Santa Fe Alliance for Science and Public Schools, Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. And I'm really happy to see you all here because I really want to share with you something that I think is the most interesting thing in the world, and that is what makes us human? And that's the question that's been driving me. So young people, of course, that's one of the most important things for you to figure out, isn't it? You're trying to figure out who you are in the world. And you do that by figuring out what your relationships with your peers are and your teachers and the adults around you. Maybe even you go back to your grandparents. You want to know where did they come from, and maybe a little further back. But what I'm interested in is going back deeper and farther than that, way back before 1492, way back before 500 BC, way back into something called deep time, where our ancestors as humans, our human ancestors, first sprang to life on this earth. So to give you a sense of how long ago and how, for me it's really exciting. It sounds like big numbers. For me somehow to tell the story in terms of millions of years, it makes me feel like I'm part of something enormous and vast. I'm part of the whole stream of life on earth. And that's why it's interesting to me. So I was thinking we could use that wall, and we could imagine that that wall's a timeline. So if we start over in the corner and we say, that's not the beginning, we're not going to start at the very beginning of the earth or even the beginning of life on earth. Let's just start when real plants and animals, critters with more than one cell, started to appear on earth and started to be common on earth. So let's say that's 600 million years ago over in the corner. Life goes on. We get fishes and reptiles emerging through evolution. We get to the dinosaurs over there by the exit sign. All that time, and we finally get to the dinosaurs. Oh, thanks, Matt, with the laser pointer. Okay. The dinosaurs are pretty well gone by the time you get, say, halfway to the next wall or so. And our ancestors, the first ones that walked upright on 2 feet, they're over in the corner. And we're jammed up. There's 1492. There's 500 BC jammed up in that corner. So as humans, our family, our human family, has not been around very long in the whole perspective of life on Earth. And so what's interesting to me is how did we make that journey to becoming hominids? So that's a word I'm going to use today, and I just want to make you familiar with it. Hominids means members of our human family. What I'm going to do, and Matt is going to do, Matt's the guy who drew all these magnificent pictures, and you'll see more. I wrote the stories that inspired the pictures. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to reconstruct, bring to life those ancestors in our imagination, those human ancestors. And where we started to learn about them was in little pieces of bone. These are plastic replicas that were found. This was found in 1925, but the original bone belonged to a creature that walked upright like we do, that lived 2.5 million years ago. I'm going to tell you the story of this little creature. You can see we've got its jaw. Oh gosh, whew. That looks good on the video. We've got its jaw, we've got its face, and we have one other piece that is absolutely fascinating, because when this little guy died at age 3 or 4, sand filled its skull eventually and made a mold or a cast of the inside of its skull. So we can even tell, because the brain leaves impressions on the bones, we can tell a little bit about the brain of this individual too. This one's called The Tong Child. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read a bit of a story, and Matt's illustrations are going to come up so you can see them about the story. And then we're going to stop, and we're going to talk about the process of bringing bones like that to life. And then we're going to give you guys a chance to ask questions. So we have a little question and answer period. And then we'll read another story and do the same thing. These stories are fiction. But what I did when I wrote the stories is I did all the research I possibly could about what kind of plants and animals were found when these were dug up, what lived then, what other creatures were around, what can the shape of the bones and teeth tell us about their lives. And I tried to be as faithful to the absolute facts as I could. But then, of course, feelings don't turn into fossils, do they? Words don't turn into fossils. So that part I made up using as much of I could about the scientific information. So let me read you. I'll just start right off with this first story. This is this little guy 2.5 million years ago in South Africa at a place called Tong. Whack! The sound of a heavy branch hitting a hollow log echoed through the sunny clearing and into the woods beyond. The young male hominid spread his bare feet wider apart for balance. He lifted the branch again high in the air. A breeze ruffled the brown-black fur on his arms. His wide, flat nostrils quivered at the scent of resin rising from chipped bark. The youngster grinned, gleeful and defiant, and hit the log again. Whack, whack, woo! Whoops. Wah! A startled infant fussed at the racket. The baby's mother, the dominant female in the troop, gave the would-be upstart a warning look. She snuggled her baby closer in the circle of her arm. She scratched her neck and watched her older son, a 4-year-old, and that's this guy, a 4-year-old who had picked up a stick of his own. The excited little male began to hit a tree trunk, imitating his teenage cousin. The other members of the hominid troop, a handful of adults and several youngsters between 3 and 10 years old, stopped what they were doing to watch the entertainment. The teenager on the log had issued a challenge. Would anyone rise to meet it? Whack! The group's dominant male was a muscular hominid with shrewd brown eyes and wiry, grizzled fur sprouting from his broad shoulders and back. He was enjoying a bout of grooming. He shifted beneath the nimble fingers of the patient female who was combing through his fur. He lifted his chin to look at the youngster on the log. He glanced across the clearing at 2 large males, his longtime allies. They returned his look, a question in their eyes. The leader shook his head. He decided it wasn't worth interrupting a soothing bout of grooming to tussle with a show-off. The leader turned around, lifting one arm to allow his flank to be groomed. Now his back was to the upstart. Taking a clue from the leader's behavior, the rest of the group went back to lounging and grazing on the tender green acanthus shoots that had sprouted in the clearing. They carefully stripped the bark and leaves from the slender green sticks, then chewed on the inner pith until their mouths were stuffed with wads of starchy, stringy pulp. Pith wasn't their favorite food. But for a few months every year, before the fruit came in, they depended on it. The would-be upstart jumped up and down on the log, waving his branch in the air. Would no one pay attention? Whoo! Whack, 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 whoo, whoo! Hoo-hoo, echoed the 4-year-old's high voice. The nursing mother shifted her infant to get a better grip. She stood up, took her 4-year-old by the hand, and began pulling him away from the clearing. The little one dug his heels in, squealing. Something exciting was about to happen. He wanted to stay and watch. His feet left shallow, parallel tracks in the dust and leaves as his mother dragged him out of danger. Whack! Whizzz. The young male on the log threw his branch. It struck the leader in the back. Suddenly furious, the leader leaped to his feet. In 3 quick steps, he had reached the log. He knocked the younger hominid onto his back and sat on him, snarling and growling. The pinned youngster kicked and tried to bite, but he was helpless. The leader's allies leaned forward to watch the struggle, their eyes shining with interest. Their heads tilted to one side. They did not need to help. It was clear their friend had the upper hand. On the other side of the clearing, another pair of males stood next to each other, shifting back and forth from one foot to another. They were brothers of the youngster, now being pummeled. They knew their brother was overpowered and could be injured, but if they helped him, they might provoke a dangerous fight with the leader and his allies. They waited to see what would happen. They were wise to hesitate. As the sting on his back had faded, so had the leader's anger. The youngster was not a real threat, but he had to show everyone that he was the leader. Does this sound like some playground you've been on? He aimed one last open-handed blow at the younger male's face. He hit hard enough to break skin, but not bones or teeth. The leader stood up, gesturing to his allies to follow him into the forest. He left the upstart whimpering on the grassy floor of the clearing. The injured youngster's brothers and a wide-eyed adolescent female went over to where he lay on the ground. When the female reached out to touch his bleeding face, the young male batted her hand away with an angry grunt. He sat up and wiped his face on his arm. He stared at the blood on his fur. He managed to get to his feet, swayed, then regained his balance and slunk off into the forest alone. He felt humiliated. He found some leaves and wiped the blood off his arm and face. He climbed a tree and sat brooding for many hours. At last, thirsty and lonely, he climbed down and set out for a nearby waterhole. When the chastened upstart found the rest of the troop, they were scattered along a granite outcrop overlooking one of their favorite waterholes. In the wet season, the riverbed filled with a wide, cold running stream. Now in the dry season, the water formed a long string of shallow pools, connected by a slow trickle of murky water and surrounded by a bed of trampled mud. This was where forest animals, including the hominids, came to drink. Most of the adults had found a grooming partner. The grooming pairs were focused intently on their work, calming each other after the confrontation between the leader and the brazen teenager. 2 mothers sat nursing their babies. The infants made soft, contented grunts, gazing into their mother's eyes. One baby kneaded the fur of his mother's chest with a tiny hand. The other one, a child of about 2 years old, twirled a strand of fur around its index finger as it sucked. The 4-year-old was wrestling with a friend, a wiry female, a year older than he. Now both children flopped onto their bellies and lay side by side, breathing fast, their chins resting on their hands. They watched the upstart cousin as he sat, slumped over, and came to sit a few yards away from the group. He hunched over, arms wrapped around his drawn-up knees, avoiding eye contact. The 4-year-old called out softly, "Woo?" The little hominid had not witnessed the beating. He still admired the daring of his older cousin. The upstart looked at the children out of the corner of his eye. The 4-year-old took this as a sign of encouragement. Crawling on hands and knees, he crept closer. His 5-year-old friend crept in close behind. The children froze when the upstart turned his head to look at them. When he looked away, they scooted forward again. When they were close enough, the children flung themselves on their cousin. He wrestled them to the ground, grinning, and tickled them till they squealed. The sound of splashing interrupted the tickling game. The hominids watched as 2 female giraffes, followed by a calf on its spindly legs, advanced cautiously across the swamp. So this is one of my favorite drawings of Matt's, is this ancient cousin of the giraffe. So the giraffes walked Warily, their nostrils flared, their eyes wide open, and their ears stiffly upright. When they reached the end of the stream, they bent their short necks and lapped up water. But every few moments, the adults raised their massive heads and scanned the surroundings with huge round eyes before they drank again. The striped calf splashed at the water's edge. Its hoofs made a sucking sound in the mud. A few red-coated monkeys came down to the water, too. They backed away when a trio of long-necked water birds swooped low with harsh nasal calls. Once the birds had settled, the monkeys settled, too. The 4-year-old and his friend sat next to each other on the ledge above the water hole. The hominid children watched the calf, entranced by its playfulness and youth. Then the 4-year-old hominid opened his eyes wide and made a sudden, soft, terrified yip. He jumped and ran to his mother, hiding his face in the rough fur of her neck. When the rest of the hominid troop realized what the 4-year-old had seen, they craned their necks forward. They were fascinated and horrified at the same time. There, a saber-toothed cat crouched in the low-growing shadows. Its dappled body was barely visible beneath a bank of shrubbery. Its stubby tails twitched once. Its eyes glinted as it turned its head to follow the cavorting calf. The hominids sat motionless, poised to run. The 4-year-old clung to his mother, his face buried in her coarse fur. He could hear the snuffing sound of the adult giraffes, still drinking their fill. He could hear the calf splashing and the monkeys chattering. He risked a peek. He saw the saber-tooth creep silently forward, its belly almost touching the ground. He could see the muscles in its shoulders bulge with tension, its massive neck arched in concentration as the calf came nearer and nearer. The 4-year-old felt his mother relax. There was no need to run away. The hominids were not the ones in danger. Then, in a sudden silent motion, the saber-tooth sprang forward, mouth open wide, bearing 6-inch fangs. The jaws closed. The calf was dead even before the flurry of desperate splashing, beating wings, monkey screams, and terrified hoofbeats settled down. So the story goes on, but that's all I'm going to read of that section. And my research involved finding out what animals and plants lived at the time this individual lived, what he ate, what his group ate, looking at other kinds of animals and what kind of social life, that means who'd they hang out with and what were their families like. But Matt's research involved how to draw what the story's about. Oh, and I think microphone-wise, we need to stand close to, yeah, we're sticking together because we have one microphone. Okay.
So this was really a lot of fun for me to work on. I specialize in natural history illustration. I do work for museums and zoos. But this was really the first time I had a chance to work with a lot of fossil hominids or early humans. And so it was a little bit different an experience for me. You know, working with animals, that's okay. People, you know, they know animals, but they don't know their faces quite as well as we know our own faces. We're geared to see all these cues with our expressions. If you want to show a human or a human-like hominid that wants to convey a specific emotion, whether it's fear or concern or bewilderment, there are cues that we pick up on all the time in our faces. And I had to learn how to translate that into the faces of these people, basically, that no one had ever seen before or knew what they looked like. So where we start with that is always with the fossils. The fossils of these ancient humans can tell us a lot about what their features might have looked like. They can give us a rough sense of the proportions of their faces, how big their eyes were, how they changed from when they were small, like the 4-year-old, to when they became adults, like the sort of grizzled male that we saw before. You know, some things we'll never know, like color, probably how much fur they had. We had to make educated guesses, and a lot of that was working back and forth with Anne. I mean, really, this process involved a ton of sketches. I brought one sketchbook here that I filled up working on this project early on, and you can see, start with the fossils, sitting down with casts of the actual material and sketching it to get a sense of the proportions, to get a sense of how these hominids might have looked when they were alive. And from there, we start, or I started, roughing out some muscles, coming up with general proportions, basically fleshing in the bones, like we said in the title of the talk. And from there, then we come up, Anne had these wonderful stories, and they were really rich descriptions of what life might have been like for these people that lived. And I say people, that's a little bit of a contentious word. Some modern people might not consider them people, but I've drawn them and brought them to life for the past couple of years, so they're people to me. But I had to put them in a scene, set the scene, set the story, bring these animals and environments and characters to life. So, starting to sketch out a lot of rough ideas. This is one, series of sketches just for this scene, coming up with rough layouts and proportions, figuring out what these animals looked like too. A lot of these animals, like this giraffe, really haven't been worked on by a lot of artists in the past. So it's a mix of looking at modern animals, just like I was looking at modern humans. Step closer?
Yeah. So
okay.
Because people in the back can see that.
Oh, and,
can everybody see?
I can
you guys see?
pass this around too if people want to take a look at it. And I would send these sketches back and forth to Anne, work up more and more complete versions, and finally get to the painting. So this really was a collaborative process between Anne and myself. She had the scientific expertise to know a lot about the proportions of these early humans and what they were physically capable of. And so I had to take that information, work it into a drawing, send it to her. She would offer me corrections, send it back. In some cases, she could actually take pictures of the fossils, overlay them on the sketches I had done, and show me where I might need to flesh out a little bit here or cut back a little bit there. So it really was a back and forth process. Mm-hmm. And I sure learned a lot. So
yeah, me too.
We can pass this around while we're talking, and let's take a look.
And did you have more to say? Because we were going to put we were going to allow you guys to ask questions at this point in between the stories. So if you have questions of Matt or me about how those got drawn or what they mean or about what these individuals look like. Anybody got questions? Don't be shy. Ah, good.
In the story you talked about how the tiger ate the early giraffe, and you said the monkeys weren't vulnerable. Were they ever eaten by the tigers?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They were.
This was easier.
Yeah, they were definitely eaten. Actually,
Who was eaten?
oh, sorry. I'm sorry that the question wasn't clear. Yes, she wanted to know if the monkeys were eaten, and I assume you also meant the hominids.
Yeah.
Yeah, were the hominids occasionally eaten by other predators? And for absolutely sure they were. As a matter of fact, this individual, this fossil, if you look at the original fossil, you apparently can see marks that are very typical of what a huge eagle would leave when it picks up a small animal. So there are apparently some marks by the eyes, which don't really show up on the plastic, and some indentations on the forehead and on the bottom that suggest that this little guy was carried away by an eagle and killed and eaten. So yes, they were definitely prey at this point. Yeah.
Post-mortem that he was carried away?
It was probably carried away and killed by the eagle. He asked if it was post-mortem. If that means after it was dead, no. It looks like the eagle treated it just like it would treat any other prey that it caught running along the ground. And the end of my story, I actually depict that, but I didn't want to spend too much time on one of the stories. Yeah, Bob?
How tall was that individual? Would that individual be?
This little guy, this was a child, probably 3 or 4 years old, and was probably just a couple feet tall. It was tiny. It weighed, I'm trying to remember the weights that they estimated, but maybe 6 or 7 pounds. Pretty small, little guy. Yeah. Yes.
How much would adults weigh?
The adults in this species, and he asked how much the adults would weigh. I actually have an adult skull from the same species. This one is affectionately called Mrs. Please, this fossil, because I used to call it Plesianthropus. So if you ever see this fossil and you see this little stripe on its head, you know that you have the same kind of creature as this tongue child, which is called Australopithecus africanus. So they were a little taller, maybe 3 feet tall, and probably maybe closer to 30, 35, 40 pounds. The females were probably quite a bit smaller than the males. Good questions. Are there other questions? Yeah, Bob.
How long ago was it?
2.5 million years, approximately. He asked how long ago it was. The dating's a little tricky because it was found in a cave that doesn't have really good datable material. But around 2.5 million years is the consensus about how old it was. Okay. So if you don't have questions, we'll move on to the next story. Anybody else?
And can we open up the chapter 2 slideshow?
Okay. So this story is set about 1,750,000 years ago, also in Africa, but this one is in East Africa, at a place called Olduvai. Little Sister's Cry. At Little Sister's Cry, 4 pairs of brown hominid eyes glanced up in startled sympathy. They watched as an 8-year-old female, the youngest member of the band, dropped the pebbles she was holding and ran across the muddy, trampled grass to her mother. When they saw that Little Sister was not badly hurt, the hominids returned to the urgent task at hand. They had found meat, and they needed to eat it before the smell attracted a hungry predator. Thumb in mouth, Little Sister squatted in front of her mother. She soon stopped whimpering, mesmerized by her mother's fierce concentration on the tool she was shaping. These are the first individuals that we know about that started to use tools of any kind on a regular basis, and their tools were made of stone. The mother raised her right arm above her head, aiming carefully. She struck sharply against the smooth, gray-black pebble in her left hand. Unlike her daughter, she managed to miss her fingers. The blow caused a thin, round flake to fly off from the underside of the cobble. The mother turned the cobble over. One more careful blow separated a flake from the other side. The scars matched up where the flakes had been removed, leaving a sharp cutting edge. The mother stood up, sharpened cobble in hand. She handed Little Sister one of the fallen flakes. Mother and daughter carried their new tools over to join the rest of the group. A sturdy teenaged male and an adolescent female moved aside to give them room. The tools sliced easily through hide and flesh, and the child's bruised thumb was forgotten as she stuffed hunks of meat into her mouth. The air was filled with the sounds of sucking, scraping, and lip smacking, accompanied by the buzzing of flies and the gurgling of a small stream that fed into the nearby lake. The little band of hominids didn't mind the stench of 2 days' dead horse. They were hungry and well accustomed to raw, rotten meat. One adult male, the leader in the group, paused to scan the area around the carcass for danger. He was a strong, wiry fellow, about 25 years old. He was the tallest member of his group, close to 5 feet in height. Like the other members of the band, he had a short, broad nose and flattish cheekbones. He was covered with sparse, coarse, chestnut brown hair, which grew longer around his prominent chin, making him appear larger than he was. His upper face, leather tough, and now smeared with grease, featured bony eyebrow ridges, framing alert brown eyes. When little sister pictured the leader in her mind's eye, it was the Longbeard that stood out. Longbeard had been the first to find the dead horse among scattered boulders at the lake shore. He had supervised the group as they separated the heavy limbs of the horse and carried them to the butchery site. The group had followed Longbeard willingly. There, they knew, were sheltering trees and plenty of stones for butchery tools. Longbeard was an experienced butcher. He had worked fast and now had managed to cut through skin, muscle, and sinew to expose the knee joint of the horse's front leg. With a final twist and deft, well-placed slice, he separated the lower part of the leg. He dragged it over to a fallen log. The horse's toes drew 3 parallel lines in the dirt. He placed the bone on a stump and scraped away the remaining flesh. He used one hand to steady the bone while he hammered sharply against it near the upper end. Finally, the bone cracked open. The rest of the group left the carcass and squatted near Longbeard. They made little moans of excitement as he lifted a glistening pinkish yellow rope of marrow from the bone's central cavity. The group crowded closer in a single wave. Longbeard lifted the marrow above his upturned face, letting it dangle above his mouth, and then slowly lowered the end of the marrow till he could suck on it. He grunted with pleasure. The group around him crowded so close he almost lost his balance. Pushing away the greedy crowd, Longbeard growled. He stood up, still clenching the marrow. He tilted his head to one side, a faint frown on his face as he surveyed the group around him. They did not need words to beg. Their meaning was clear in their outstretched hands, their wide grins, and the soft cajoling tone of their eager murmurs. Who would be favored with a morsel of energy? He looked at his mother, at little sister squatting near her. He handed each of them a generous piece of the marrow rope. They grinned and sat back on their heels, sucking the fatty gobs. The other female was new to the group. She was about 14, just reaching adulthood. Her reddish pelt shone in the sun. Red pelt kept her eyes on Longbeard, but halfway turned her body from him so he could see how pretty and sleek she was. She inched towards him, hand outstretched. He broke off a sizable piece from the fatty rope and handed it to her. She nuzzled him in thanks before she walked over towards the stream to savor her treat in solitude. Longbeard looked at the teenaged male, considering. He might use the marrow as the bribe to cement his relationship with the youngster. It might win him an ally. Or it might just give the youngster energy to mount a challenge for leadership of the group. He finally looked the youngster in the eye and swallowed the rest of the marrow himself in a single gulp. The teenage male yelled and hooted. He grabbed the leg bone from the log and waved it in the air. The older male belched and walked away at a leisurely pace. He squatted on a patch of dry ground near an upturned turtle shell, scratching his furry flank, ignoring the teenager's display. He wasn't threatened yet by the empty tantrum of a disgruntled teenager. A dark movement in the undergrowth caught the eye of the howling teenager. His cockiness turned to terror. "Wronk!" he cried, "wronk!" The rest of the hominid group stopped in mid-chew. They knew the cry meant he had spotted a crocodile hiding in the tall grass near the marshy edge of the lake. There it was, a dark, blunt snout emerging from the reeds. The crocodile dragged its long body out of the marsh. Its cold eyes were fixed on Red Pelt, who stood as still as a boulder, paralyzed with terror. The teenage male bellowed. He ran towards the crocodile, waving the leg bone. "Ruankawa!" he cried again and again. His meaning should have been clear to the dimmest of crocodile brains. The crocodile paused for a few seconds, but then he lumbered forward again, sounding a low, threatening hiss. The teenager threw the leg bone towards the advancing monster. The missile landed wide, but it distracted the crocodile long enough for Red Pelt to come to her senses. She scuttled up the hill. With powerful arms, she hoisted herself into a tree near the rest of the group. Red Pelt shrieked as the crocodile veered towards her rescuer, putting on a burst of speed. Its hiss became a roar. The young male turned and ran. He was so intent on escape that he almost tripped on the remains of the butchered carcass. The crocodile galloped after him, its huge tail knocking aside stone, tools, and bones from its path. Then, without warning, the monster slowed down. His legs splayed out and sank to the ground with a final deflating hiss. The crocodile moved its snout slowly from side to side, sniffing. It crawled forward a few more feet, opened its jaws halfway, and swallowed a meat bone whole. The hominids in the trees watched the crocodile slither back to the marsh on splayed out legs, belly scraping the dirt. "Rawonka wah!" they shouted. When he heard the shout, the teenager glanced over his shoulder in time to see the scaly tip of the crocodile's tail disappear into the reeds. The young male put his hands on his hips and puffed out his chest. He tilted his head back and he yelled, "Rawonka wah!" He sauntered up to the hill to join the rest of the band, trying to look modest. Every few steps, he stopped to pick up a petal to throw at the spot where the crocodile had entered the marsh. Red Pelt swung down from her branch and shyly held out a sliver of shiny marrow to her rescuer. The young male grinned as he accepted it. He reached out and took Red Pelt's hand. She stood on tiptoe to whisper in his ear, "Rawakawa." Both youngsters burst into nervous giggles. From now on, Red Pelt and the rest of the band would think of the young male as Rawonkawa. The youngsters were startled out of their laughter by the arrival of 2 vultures that landed at the butchery site with a whoosh of wings and a flurry of possessive squawks. Longbeard signaled a low, hoarse bark. At his signal, the hominids cautiously descended from their refuge in the trees, giving the vultures wide berth. They'd eaten a good portion of the meat. They knew that hyenas and jackals would have seen the vultures swoop down. It was time to move away from the tempting meat and look for something else to eat. Whoa! Little sister's mother pointed with her chin towards a well-worn game trail. They thought of her as the berry finder, for she was the best forager in the group. Berry finder always knew when the many kinds of fruits and nuts in the valley were ripe. Little sister held tight to berry finder's hand for a few yards. Then she let go and ran a little way. She'd been to the berry patch with her mother only a few days earlier. She was eager to taste the sweet juice and tart, crunchy seeds again. Longbeard followed berry finder at a dignified pace, swinging the heavy lava cobble in his hand. Good chopper stones were hard to find. He had found this one at the mouth of a small river, 2 kilometers to the southeast. He had carried it with him for several days. He rubbed his thumb over a chip in the sharp, flaked edge. He had damaged his tool when he broke open the marrow bone. No matter, he could easily remove another flake or 2 to produce a sharp, fresh edge. He wasn't about to leave such a fine tool behind. I'm actually going to cut this a little bit short, but I want Matt go on to the next slide, which is one of my favorite, which is the 2 teenagers playing with rocks. So these are people who had discovered the properties of stone, and they discovered the properties of stone for tools. But when I told the story, I realized that certainly they must also have been aware of the stone in many other dimensions. So I had these youngsters playing with them to indicate how important a part rocks and stones played in their lives. And I actually brought along a fake cobble out of lava. So if you were one of those ancient hominids and you wanted to make a nice sharp edge, what you do is you take a stone like this that probably fit pretty nicely in your hand, and you take another stone and you give it a really good, well-aimed whack. If you didn't pinch your fingers, off the other side would come a flake. And then you could turn it over and whack it, and off the other side comes another flake. Just like if something hits your windshield, you get a little round, hollow scar on the inside of the windshield. It's the same thing with making stone flakes. And archaeologists have made stone tools like this and found that they actually are quite good for butchering. So around this site where Rawankaba and Red Pelt lived, or at least where fossils like this lived, you'll find lots and lots of those stone cobbles. So Matt, you want to talk about drawing these scenes?
Sure. One of the things that was a lot of fun about this chapter was, and really all the chapters to this book, is we get to see a little bit of the changing environment that these hominids are living in. They sort of start out a little more tree-based, a little closer to the forest with Tong Child in the last chapter. Now they're kind of, as I understand it, moving out into the open, exploiting new food sources that they can use their stone tools to process meat, get marrow out of bones, and becoming a little more mobile, I think. And I wanted to show that in these scenes, show a little bit more open country, still the hint of the forest, protective areas in the background. The features on this group, this was probably my most challenging chapter because this is the first species that is in our genus, Homo. The earlier group wasn't a hominid called Australopithecus. This is as I understand, the first Homo species.
It's always
to the
debatable
first.
when
Right.
you're talking about fossil hominids, but sure, we'll go with that for tonight.
So, I wanted to make it a little bit
Yeah.
closer to us, a little bit more recognizable, maybe make the nose and the faces a little less, with a little less ape-like features, a little more human, but not get them too close, because we still had 1.875 million years to go.
And you had to be faithful to the bones.
And I had to be faithful to the bones. So, I mean, that definitely adds a lot of, you can sort of see, I'm just going to hold up this bone. In all the skulls and reconstructions that I looked at, I mean, we've got these kind of wide cheeks, really wide, flat cheeks. And I wanted to show that in these reconstructions that, I mean, I kind of thought of them almost as moon face because they just had these big, broad cheeks. They probably would have still had pretty powerful jaws, and that's another thing. And the front of their skulls sort of projecting out, not quite as flat as ours, but not quite as projecting as the earlier group that really had a really strong forward-facing snout. Also changing the skin color a little bit, didn't want it to be too ape-like, didn't want it to be too human, so I came up with this sort of neutral gray that was a little bit based on orangutans, but not totally because it's in a very different environment. And a little bit of pigment, but not too much, sort of signaling that they might not be completely out in the open and fully exposed to the sun, but also not as protected in the canopies as the earlier group. So that admittedly is very speculative on my part. I don't know how much of this I actually talked over with Anne. She might be very surprised to hear some of this, but hopefully it came out in a way that's scientifically acceptable. But the other thing that I think we wanted to talk about with this chapter were the animals and the crocodile in the scene, which was a really fun story. And I think this really shows like how really doing your homework can get you to places that that are perfect, really. And the reason I say that, if I go back to the crocodile slide, and get
We're
out
in
of
the,
the
we're
way
in
of
the
the
middle of
crocodile.
it. We're in the middle of it, yeah.
So Anne did a lot of research when she was working on these chapters and finding out, what animals, what bones were found alongside the hominids that lived at each of these sites. And so she created these stories where they would interact with different animals, the eagle in the earlier chapter, the crocodile that we just heard about, and created the story based on that. So shortly after I started working on the project, I went to a conference where paleontologists were presenting new finds. And there was a talk about a fossil crocodile that lived alongside Homo habilis in Olduvai. And what was really fascinating is that they found proof that, or as close to proof as you can get, that crocodiles, this one new species of crocodile probably had been eating our early ancestors. They found signs from some ankle bones that had tooth marks that were fairly distinctive with the pattern made by crocodile teeth. And the new species of crocodile sort of matched up with that. So I talked to the guy after the conference. I asked him if I might be able to work it into the drawing. He said, sure. Gave me a couple of pointers as far as the anatomy went. It was just earlier this year described as a new species of crocodile called Crocodilus anthropophagus, which means the man-eating crocodile.
Man-eater. Oh, cool.
But of course, this hadn't happened. None of this was known when Anne wrote the book, except for the fact that there was some crocodiles. So we had this scene that matched a new discovery that, we didn't know about when I started the drawing and when Anne was writing the book. So
That was pretty fun.
Yeah.
That was very cool. Does anybody have questions about this story or this process? Yeah.
The horse that died, was that was a small horse, wasn't it? Because the horses we know today are rather large, but the horse then was a small animal that would have died probably of natural causes, I would assume. What was he called?
I actually, this horse was probably a fairly large horse by this time. When I started writing this story, I'm sorry, I forgot to let you all know what the question is about the horse, and what kind of horse was it, and weren't ancient horses smaller? And the tiny little horses like Eohippus and you probably know more of the ancient horse names than I do, Matt. Yeah. But the tiny little horses, Hipparion is one of them, which had 3 to 5 toes. They lived long before this. Even now, by the time we get to Olduvai Gorge at this point, there are a few 3-toed horses, but they're definitely not the tiny little guys. And by the time you get, they're almost modern. Just like really, in a lot of ways, these hominids are almost modern. So yeah, that's an excellent question. I really wanted to draw some little tiny horses, but then I found out when I started writing the book that they were gone by now. So, yes?
Were there any signs of warfare or cannibalism
Among these groups, were there signs of warfare or cannibalism? No, for a couple reasons. One, we just do not have enough bones to be definitive, but probably also they were in such scattered groups, they probably didn't interact in an aggressive way with other groups any more than chimpanzees do today, for example, which is occasionally when they're pushed into too small territories by us. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, Bob?
Would you say, do they have a kind of language that they communicate with? Or
Yeah, that's language, the language question. That is so intensely controversial. What we know about their brains, though, is that we're starting to see changes in the brain that suggest they're really beginning to have a more complex kind of a thinking process. Some people, you've got all kinds of opinions about language. You've got some people who say we are the only critters that have ever had a full language. And that's only been going on for 50,000 years. You find other people, like we just did an interview on the radio with Mary Charlotte, and she was convinced that I had not given them enough language. So that's controversial because we can't know. So I gave them symbols for crocodile, crocodile away. And I also, later in the story, they're able to talk about the past and they're able to talk about the future. And language that isn't just about what's happening in this very room, but talks about the past and the future, I thought that was a reasonable kind of language to give them. Did you guys have some questions over here?
Were they omnivores?
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah, and you can tell that from their teeth. Could I, before you answer your second question, do you want me to, I'd like to show you. He asked if they were omnivores. What do they eat? This is not a good sample because it doesn't have very good teeth on it. But you can tell that they had a lot of different kinds of teeth. Teeth for cutting and teeth for chewing. So they would eat fruit, meat, probably anything they could get a hold of. Good question.
and what was the name of the species again?
Oh, this is Homo habilis.
Of the crocodile?
Oh, the crocodile, Matt.
Oh, the crocodile is Crocodilus, which is the same genus that modern crocodiles are. The species name is Anthropophagus, which is Anthropophagus, the man-eating crocodile.
We can if you want have questions about spelling later, we can also help you with that. So yeah. Yes.
One more question. So on the language thing, you kind of gave them names in the story. Do you think they have the ability to name each other and all that name? Or you know?
Did they have the ability to name each other? Yes, because naming is part of language. They certainly had the ability to recognize each other. And in this story, from my research, I am a believer that language has very ancient roots. And so that's what I showed in this story. Again, you're going to find people who have different opinions, and it's pretty hard to have any kind of scientific evidence for sure. So I think from the nature of how language works, from the kinds of language you see, even in parrots. You ever hear of Alex the parrot, he had a vocabulary of 450 words. Coco the gorilla has a huge vocabulary and makes up new phrases and names new individuals. She had a little kitten named, when she got it, she named it Ball. So I think that they at least had mental names for each other. Okay, but it's a guess. Other questions? Okay, so we have a few minutes left.
We did have one more question.
Oh, we did? Oh, I didn't see it.
Can they climb trees like other primates, modern primates, or are they like us? Or they can't really climb trees?
That's such a good question. And yes, it looks like their bodies were built still to be able to climb trees. So I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that. But his question was about, did they climb trees like modern primates? And probably not like modern primates. I think they were making compromises by now. So their fingers are not quite as curved. Their arms are not quite as long as some of the primates, the apes that we see today, for example. But yes, there's probably good chance they climb trees for safety, as some people who live in this kind of environment still do. And if I saw a crocodile coming, I'd do my best to get up a tree. So, but it looks like their bodies were still built somewhat for tree climbing. Good question. Yeah.
They were taller. How much taller than the last?
The taller males were probably, how tall were they? The taller males were probably around 5 feet. And again, it's probably the females were smaller.
So they were almost human.
Yeah, I'm 5'2", so they were something like that. The males anyway. Good question. Other questions? So we have about, looks like we have about 6 minutes, which isn't quite enough to read another story, but maybe, Matt, we could just go ahead and show some of the other pictures and talk about them really briefly.
Should we go to the
Let's go to the
Ahmed
Neanderthal.
chapter?
Let's go to the Ahmed chapter.
Could
Yeah.
I ask you to open chapter 4?
So you've probably heard of them. And that's a cave in Israel called Ahmed Cave. And Matt, you drew that from photographs.
Right.
Yeah. He drew it from photographs of the cave.
I did not get to travel to Israel as part of this project.
But as soon as our book becomes a bestseller, we are on the plane, right?
Right.
Okay. So, yeah, the next slide. This is one of my favorite scenes in the book. Neanderthals were getting to a point where there was real symbolic behavior and some hints of art. One of the things that really does make us human. We have found clays and different kinds of colored materials in sites where Neanderthals have been. Not a lot and not often, but they were using it for something. So in this story, I had the mother here, Alapa is her name, paint the boy's face to go deer hunting. Actually, this is a pretty fun picture because Matt and I had a lot of back and forth because I thought that I wanted him to mess up the kid's hair a little more. And I wanted him to make the stole a little less elegant. So it was actually one of our good discussions, wasn't it?
Yeah,
one of our better discussions.
I just put up a series of images, sketches. This is sort of how I started it out, with a sort of rough stole. But then talking with Anne, she was, I sort of have it loosely stitched together. And that might be not quite the level of technology that we could feel comfortable defending.
Needles were not found till much later than this. So.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
out. So how else is it going to be hanging? And so then I sort of came up with, and Anne also wanted to show some identifiable pieces of animal. Like, these weren't fine tailors. They were very functional. You have an animal that has warm fur, you're going to put it on. This is the Ice Age, I think.
Yeah. Well, it was.
I mean,
There were chilly times. It was Israel, so it was a little warmer.
yeah.
And also, there were foxes found at the site, so I wanted to show that.
So I started with this and then worked up the color version of it. But with all the foxtails, again, it looked a little too finished. Like there was some craft going into it, and it wasn't quite as crude. And we really wanted the craft to focus more on what was going on with Ut's face and his face painting. And I did keep his hair slicked back, thinking, with
He
modern
won. He
groups,
won that one.
Yeah, going out on a hunt, you don't want stringy, messy hair. You're going to take the time to paint the face. Maybe you throw some grease in your hair. But I did mess up his face and his hair in other pictures. So
Yeah.
I think we did compromise a little bit.
Yeah, we did.
And in the end, so we have a much less finished, more patchwork fur.
Yeah.
So
Okay, we got a couple minutes just for one question. Pardon me?
Did they cut their hair?
They certainly could have. They had lovely stone tools that could have easily cut their hair. To get it out of their way? Did they cut their hair? I think they could have, for sure. No reason not to. So that's the end of our tape. We're here to answer questions. We're here to show you the fossils and the skulls, and would love for you to come up and take a look at them and spend some time with us. Thanks a lot. You were great, and I loved your questions.